Every Thanksgiving for 11 years, the corner booth at Delray's Diner was reserved for a man who never called ahead. He simply appeared sometime around noon in the same dark wool coat he had worn since anyone could remember, with a battered paperback tucked under one arm and a patience about him that made the air around him feel quiet. He always ordered the same thing: the full turkey plate, a cup of black coffee, and a slice of pecan pie with no whipped cream. He always ate alone. He always left a folded $10 bill under the salt shaker, no matter what the bill came to. And every year, without fail, he said thank you to whoever served him with a weight that made the word feel like it cost him something. His name was Walter, and for most of those 11 years, Renee had no idea who he really was. She had been 17 the first time she waited on him, filling in for her aunt during the holiday rush while still in her second year of high school, her apron too big and her handwriting on the order pad unsteady. She remembered thinking he looked like a man who had been somewhere and come back carrying the weight of it. Not sad, exactly. Settled. Like a person who had decided something long ago and lived inside that decision without fuss. She remembered thinking he had kind eyes. She had not thought much else about him. She was 17 and she had places to be after her shift. But she had come back the following Thanksgiving, this time as a regular part-timer, and Walter had been there again, and the year after, and the year after that. If you pay attention, the world will occasionally show you the same person over and over until you finally learn to ask the right question. Renee would spend 11 years learning to ask. Think about the last time someone made you feel truly seen, not flattered, not noticed the way a stranger notices a coat or a haircut, but genuinely seen, the way it feels when someone knows who you are underneath the tired and the worn. If you have felt it, you understand why Renee carried what she learned about Walter for the rest of her life. Stay with her now. Renee had grown up 2 miles from Delray's, in the kind of neighborhood where the houses were close together and the yards were small and everyone knew when your car wouldn't start because they could hear you trying. Her mother, Claudette, had worked the breakfast and lunch shift at a different diner across town for most of Renee's childhood, and her father had been present until Renee was 9 and absent after that, in the particular way of men who simply recede. There were 2 younger brothers, Marcus and Deon, and there was a grandmother named Ruth who watched the boys on school days and kept a small Bible on the kitchen table with a dried flower pressed between 2 pages near the back. They were not poor in the way people mean when they want to signal catastrophe. They were poor in the quiet, grinding way, where the math was always tight and the margin was always thin and the warmth in the house came from people, not from the furnace, which broke every other winter. Renee had started at Delray's at 17, not because she loved the work, but because she loved her aunt, who ran the counter and needed the help, and because the $15 an hour plus tips was $15 an hour plus tips. She discovered she was good at it. She had a memory for orders that never wavered, and a way of moving through the diner that was efficient without being cold, and people tipped her well because she made them feel like the only table in the room, even when the place was full. By the time she was 20, she was full-time. By 23, she was the best server on staff, and her manager, a stocky man named Pete, who wore the same polo shirt in 3 colors on rotation, had offered her the shift supervisor position twice. She had turned it down both times. She had plans that didn't include staying at Delray's. She was taking 2 classes a semester at the community college, working toward a nursing certificate, and she kept a spiral notebook in her bag where she tracked her hours and her savings with the precision of someone who knew exactly how close the margin was. The third Thanksgiving. Walter came in. Renee was 20, and she had started to notice him the way you notice a word that keeps appearing in different books. He came in at 11:45 before the real rush, hung his coat on the hook at the end of the booth, and opened his paperback. When she brought the coffee, he looked up and said, "You're Claudette's girl." She said yes. He said, "She used to bring me coffee when I was having a bad spell. Good woman." He said nothing more and went back to his book. Renee went back to her other tables, but she turned it over in her mind for the rest of the shift. By the 6th year, they had built something that did not have a name. It was not friendship exactly, and it was not the easy familiarity of regular customer and long-time server, though it was that too. It was more like a private acknowledgement between 2 people who recognized in each other a quality they didn't often see reflected in the world. Renee had started asking him simple questions when she refilled his coffee. He answered them simply. He had been a high school history teacher for 31 years, retiring at 62 when his knees gave out and the stairs became a negotiation. He had one daughter, Lydia, who lived in Phoenix and called every Sunday. He had been married for 38 years to a woman named Dorothy, who had passed 4 years before Renee met him, and he still spoke of her in the present tense sometimes, catching himself mid-sentence with a small pause that Renee learned not to fill. He read 2 or 3 books a week and walked 3 miles every morning if the weather permitted. He was not a man of great wealth or great sorrow. He was a man who had lived a full life and was now living the remainder of it with the same quiet deliberateness he had brought to all the rest. She asked him once, in the 8th year, why he came alone. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought she had overstepped. Then he said, "Dorothy and I used to come here every Thanksgiving for the first 15 years we were married. After she passed, I thought about stopping, but this is where she was happy, so I keep coming." He picked up his coffee. "Besides," he said, "you're here." He said it plainly, without sentiment, the way a person states a fact they consider worth stating. Renee did not trust herself to answer, so she refilled his cup and moved to the next table. But she felt it for the rest of the day, that sentence, like a hand placed briefly on her shoulder. What she did not know then, what she had no way of knowing, was that Walter had been watching her for years in a way that went beyond the pleasant habit of a familiar face. He had noticed things. He had noticed the nursing textbook she studied at the back counter during slow stretches. He had noticed the night she came in for a double shift with her left eye swollen from a car door she swore she had walked into, and the way she moved through her tables with a steadiness that clearly cost her something. He had noticed when she went from 2 classes a semester to 1, and then to none for a full year, and then back to 1 again, the irregular rhythm of a person doing their best against a current that kept pushing back. He had noticed because he had spent 31 years noticing the students in his classroom who were working twice as hard for half the result through no fault of their own, and he recognized the quality. He had a word for it that he had used in his classroom for decades. He called it faithfulness. Not faith in the religious sense, though he respected that too, but faithfulness in the original sense, staying true to a direction even when the road offered no encouragement. He had recognized it in Renee when she was 20 years old, and he had never stopped recognizing it. The 9th year, Renee almost didn't make it to Thanksgiving. Her mother had been diagnosed with an irregular heart rhythm in October. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to require monitoring and a specialist, and the particular anxiety that descends when the person who held your childhood together becomes suddenly, plainly mortal. Renee had cut back her college hours again and picked up extra shifts to help cover the gap, and by the time the holiday came she was running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and the particular exhaustion that lives behind the eyes. She came in on Thanksgiving morning, and Walter was already there, coat hung, book open, coffee waiting. She brought his turkey plate and he looked at her and said, "How's your mother?" She had told him about Claudette in October, briefly, while refilling his coffee on a Tuesday. He had remembered. She sat down across from him for 2 minutes, which she never did, and told him the specialist thought she would be fine with medication. He nodded. "Good," he said. "She raised someone worth keeping." Renee stood up and went back to work. She did not cry until she was in the walk-in cooler at the end of her shift, alone among the stacked trays where no one could hear her. In the 10th year, Walter did not come. Renee waited all through the Thanksgiving rush, checking the door between tables, and he did not appear. She called information that evening for his number and reached a machine and left a message saying she hoped he was all right. 3 days later, he called back. He had been in the hospital with a bout of pneumonia, nothing fatal but enough to keep him home and flat for 2 weeks. His daughter Lydia had flown in from Phoenix. He sounded thin over the phone, not diminished but thin. The way a person sounds when they have been reminded recently that the body has its own calendar. He said he was sorry to have missed her. She said she was glad he was home. He said he would see her next year. He kept that promise. The 11th Thanksgiving, Walter came in at 11:50, a little later than usual, moving more carefully than she remembered. His coat the same, his paperback the same, his order the same. She brought his coffee first, and he looked up and said, "Still here," she said. "Still here." He smiled. It was the clearest smile she had ever seen on him, and she had seen 11 years of his face. She thought of Dorothy and of the 15 Thanksgivings they had spent in this booth, and she thought of her own mother taking her medication every morning, and of Marcus now grown and working construction, and of Dion finishing his last semester at the state school, and she thought that there were people in a life who hold you in place without ever making a show of it, who simply appear and reappear, steady as a nail in a wall, and you understand the weight of what they carry only when you imagine the wall without them. The story of what happened after the 11th Thanksgiving would not come to Renee until January. Walter had called Lydia in Phoenix the week after Thanksgiving and told her he wanted to write some letters. Lydia had assumed he meant correspondence with old friends, the kind of project a man in his late 70s might take up in winter when the walk became impractical. But the letters Walter wrote in December were specific and detailed and accompanied by instructions to his attorney. He had spent a long time composing them, and when Lydia flew back out in February for a long weekend, she found 6 sealed envelopes on the kitchen table, each with a name on the front. One of them had Renee's name, spelled correctly, with the name of the diner written beneath it. Walter passed away on the 9th of March, quietly and at home in his sleep, the way the people who loved him had hoped he would go. He was 78. Lydia called Delray's the following week and asked for Renee by name. Pete took the call and wrote the message on a paper napkin, which was the only paper at hand, and set it on the counter where Renee would find it. The napkin said, "Lydia Hammond, call back, about her father, Walter." Renee stood at the counter holding the napkin for a long moment. She already knew. Some news arrives before it arrives, carried in the quality of silence around it. She called Lydia that evening from her car in the parking lot of the community college, where she had gone directly after her shift for a class that had already started. Lydia answered on the second ring, and her voice was steady in the way of people who have spent several weeks preparing to make this call. She said her father had passed in March, and she hoped Renee would forgive her for not calling sooner. There had been arrangements and the estate and her own grief to manage, and she had wanted to do this properly. She told Renee that her father had mentioned her many times across many years, always by name, always with a specific detail: the nursing school, the double shifts, the mother who was unwell, the brothers her father had never met but knew about because Walter knew about everyone Renee had ever mentioned. Lydia said her father had believed that certain people were worth paying attention to, and that he had paid attention to Renee for 11 Thanksgivings. She said there was a letter. Lydia read it over the phone because she thought Renee should hear it the same way her father would have told it, in his voice, which she tried her best to carry across the connection. The letter said he had been a history teacher, and that history had taught him one reliable thing, which was that the people who held the world together were almost never the people who received credit for it. He said he had watched Renee for 11 years and had seen a person doing exactly that, holding things together, faithfully, without applause, and without apparent expectation of any. He said he thought Dorothy would have liked her. He said he hoped she finished her nursing certificate because the patients who would one day depend on her were lucky and did not know it yet. He said he had left an amount of money in his estate designated for her to be delivered in the form of a bank transfer upon the settlement of the estate, and that the amount was $43,000, one for each year of his career in the classroom and 2 more for the road. He said he did not want thanks, and he said he knew she would understand why. Renee sat in her car in the college parking lot for a long time after Lydia said goodbye. The class she had been driving toward was long over. The lot was emptying around her, other cars pulling out one by one, headlights sweeping across the concrete, and she was 31 years old. She owed $11,000 in student fees she had been paying down in increments of $200 a month, a rate that would have kept her at it for another 4.5 years. She owed 31 months remaining on her car. She had a savings account with $4,000 in it that she had been building for 6 years, adding to it whenever the margin allowed, which was not often enough. The nursing certificate was 1 semester away if she could go full-time. She had not been able to go full-time. She was looking at the math, and the math had looked back at her for 6 years without blinking. Kindness, when it finally arrives, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits across a booth from you for 11 years, quiet as good manners, and you only understand what it was when the booth is empty. The transfer arrived in April. Renee stood at the bank counter and looked at the confirmation slip with the number printed on it, $43,000, and she thought of the folded $10 bill under the salt shaker, year after year, on a check that rarely exceeded $22. She thought of the word thank you and the weight it had carried in his voice. And now she understood the weight was not sentiment. It was a man who understood what it cost to give something freely and who wanted the people around him to know that the giving had not gone unnoticed from his side either. She enrolled full-time in March of the following year. By November, she had her nursing certificate, and she had her first job offer from a hospital 12 minutes from her mother's house before Thanksgiving. She started the week before the holiday, and on the Thursday itself, when the unit was quiet in the particular way of holiday shifts, she thought of Walter. She thought of the booth and the wool coat and the paperback and the cup of black coffee with no room for anything else. She thought of him saying "still here," and she thought that was the right thing to have said, both of them still there year after year, in a world that was always asking people like her to be somewhere else. She went back to Delray's the following Thanksgiving. Not to work. She sat in the corner booth, the same one, and ordered the turkey plate and a cup of black coffee and a slice of pecan pie, with no whipped cream. Pete raised an eyebrow from behind the counter, and she said nothing. The server who came to refill her coffee was 19, new, with a name tag that read Amara, and a slightly uncertain way of holding her order pad that Renee recognized the way you recognize your own face in an old photograph. Renee left a $43 tip. Not as a statement, as a fact, the kind of quiet fact that only makes sense to the person who knows the history behind it. She stayed until the rush had settled, and the diner was nearly empty. Outside the window, the November sky had gone to the particular grey of late afternoon, the light going out of it slow and even, the street lamps beginning to come up one by one. She thought about her mother, who was well and was going to Renee's cousin's house across town. She thought about Marcus, who had married in the spring and whose wife had a laugh that filled whatever room she entered. She thought about Dayon, graduated and working and occasionally insufferable about it, in the way of younger brothers who have earned that right. She thought about Dorothy, who had been happy here, in this booth, for 15 years, and who had left a kind of happiness behind her in the wood, and the vinyl that had kept a good man coming back for 11 more. She thought about Walter's letter, and the sentence she would never forget, the one about patients who did not know yet how lucky they were. She was going to be someone's nurse tomorrow. She was going to hold the world together in the particular way that does not make the news and does not receive applause, and she was going to do it faithfully, the way she had always done everything, because that was who she was and had always been, and because a man in a wool coat had seen it and had taken the time to say so. She left her tip under the salt shaker. She put on her coat. She pushed open the door to the cold evening air and walked to her car, which was paid off now, fully and finally, and drove home. Some people show you that you are worth seeing. That is all it takes. That is everything. If someone has ever sat across from you and seen you, really seen you, the way Walter saw Renee, tell that story in the comments. Some stories deserve to be shared. And if this one moved you, there is another one waiting for you right here, just like it. Another good person, another long wait, another moment when the world finally gets it right. There are things that shape a life so quietly you almost miss them in the living. Renee understood this better at 32 than she had at 17. She understood it the way her mother Claudette understood it, the way most women who had kept things going on very little for very long eventually came to understand it. Not with bitterness, but with a clear-eyed accounting of what it had cost and what it had given back. The world was not generous by habit. The world was generous occasionally and by specific human decision, and the decision to be generous with your attention, your time, your notice, was among the quieter and more durable forms that generosity could take. Her mother had told her once that a good name was worth more than money. Renee had been 15, and she had taken it as the kind of thing mothers say, the proverb-shaped wisdom that sounds right in the abstract but sits vague when you press it for details. By the time she was holding that bank transfer confirmation in April, she understood it differently. Walter had known her name. He had known it for 11 years. He had said it aloud to his daughter with specifics attached, specific enough that Lydia had been able to find her at a diner in a city of 400,000 people with nothing more than a name and an address. A name spoken with care over many years in a private conversation by a man who had no reason to speak it except that it seemed to him worth speaking. That was the thing her mother had meant. Not reputation in the public sense, the quieter, harder-won thing, being known by someone who chose to know you. There were days during those 11 years when Renee had wondered if any of it was adding up to anything. The class she dropped when Marcus had a bad month and needed help with rent. The savings she paused when the car needed a timing belt that ran $900. The nursing certificate she could see clearly from where she stood but could not quite reach, the way a destination looks close on a map until you are walking it through actual terrain. She had not stopped. She had pulled back and adjusted and then moved forward again, the way water moves around an obstacle, not in a straight line but always in the same direction. She had thought sometimes, driving home after a double shift at 2 a.m, that persistence without recognition was a strange thing to be asked to sustain. She had never asked to be witnessed. She had only tried to do what needed doing. But there is something in the human body that keeps score of all the unwitnessed things, all the effort that goes unseen, and it accumulates in a place behind the sternum that has no name and no easy release. Walter had released it. Not with money, though the money was real and the money mattered, and she would never pretend otherwise. He had released it with the letter. Oh, with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who had watched her for 11 years and had found her worth watching. With the sentence about patients who did not yet know how lucky they were. She had read that sentence 6 times standing in the parking lot, her phone going cold in her hand, the college dark behind her. She had thought of every patient she would one day sit beside in the quiet of a hard hour. She had thought of holding a hand when the news was not good. She had thought of being the one person in a room who stayed, who didn't have somewhere else to be, who brought the glass of water and asked about the family and remembered what had been said the visit before. She had been practicing for that work for 11 years without knowing the name of what she was doing. Pete had asked her once, maybe in the 7th or 8th year, why she hadn't moved on to something better. He hadn't meant it unkindly. He was a practical man who thought in terms of opportunities and ladders, and he genuinely couldn't see what she was still doing at Del Rey's when she was clearly capable of more. She had told him she was working toward nursing, and he had nodded and left it there. She hadn't told him the rest of it, the part that was harder to explain, that she had stayed partly because the work itself was not small, that feeding a person, keeping their coffee hot, making the table feel like the rest of the world had paused for them, that this was not a lesser thing. She had watched her mother do it for years, and she had watched Walter receive it every Thanksgiving with the care of a man who understood the transaction, who understood that someone had made a choice to be present for him when they could have been home, and he had honoured that choice with his gratitude and his $10 and his 31 years of returning. The nurses on her floor would tell her later, in the first weeks of her new job, that she was the kind of nurse who made the difficult days possible. They did not mean it as a compliment exactly. They meant it as a fact of the unit's economy, the same way they'd say someone was good at the overnight inventory or reliable in a code situation. The skill they were naming was not technical. It was the thing Walter had had a word for: faithfulness. Staying present when presence was hard, bringing something real into the room when the room needed it. She had been learning it at a diner counter in an oversized apron since she was 17 years old. She had been practicing it without knowing she was practicing it, because that is the nature of a genuine character. It doesn't announce itself, it simply shows up year after year under the same fluorescent lights, in the same booth, with the same order and the same $10 bill, long past the point where anyone else was still watching. Marcus called her on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, the year she went back to the booth alone. He asked how she was, and she said she was good, and she meant it. He asked about the new job, and she talked about a patient she had been with that week. An older man, no family nearby, who had been admitted for a knee replacement and was afraid of the anesthesia, and had not wanted to say so. She had sat with him for 20 minutes before the procedure, not because it was in her job description, but because she had looked at him and seen a person who needed someone to stay. She had held his hand until he went under. When he woke, she was still in the unit, and she had checked on him on her way to another room, and he had looked at her with the particular gratitude of someone who had expected to be alone, and hadn't been. She had said it was no trouble. He had said thank you in a way that cost him something. She had understood exactly what he meant. She told Marcus this story, and Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then said, "That sounds like something Walter would have done." She thought about that for a long time after they hung up. She thought about the chain of it, the long invisible thread from the man in the booth to the woman who had learned from his watching to the man in the hospital bed who had needed someone to sit still. She did not know what to call the thread. She only knew it was real, that it ran from one person to the next in the specific way that certain human qualities pass from hand to hand across years without ever being formally taught. You receive them by being witnessed. You give them by witnessing in return. That was the whole of it. That was everything. She finished her first full year of nursing in November. The certificate was framed and hung in the hallway of the apartment she had moved into in the spring. A one-bedroom with good windows and a radiator that worked, and a view of a courtyard where 2 oak trees stood bare and patient against the grey sky. Claudette came to see the apartment the week before Thanksgiving and walked through every room with the careful attention of a woman who has spent a long time worrying about the rooms her daughter would end up in. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment and then said it was good. She said it the way she had always said the things she meant most, quietly and without elaboration. The way Renee had learned to say thank you, as though the word contained something the speaker would not be able to hold back if they said more. Renee made coffee, and they sat at the small table by the window and watched the light go thin and early through the courtyard trees, and talked about Marcus's wife and Dayon's job, and the medication that was keeping Claudette's heart in its proper rhythm, and about how the year had gone, and about how the next one would be better still. On the windowsill, Renee kept a small framed photograph of the corner booth at Delray's. Not one she had taken herself, but one that Pete had found in a box of old prints when they'd repainted the back hall. A photograph from sometime in the early 90s, the booth empty, the light coming in through the window at a low winter angle, the salt shaker and the sugar caddy and the napkin holder, all in their usual places. She had asked Pete if she could have it, and he had handed it over without asking why. She knew why. She kept it on the sill where she could see it when she made coffee in the morning. That empty booth, that square of winter light, all the people who had sat in it and gone on and what they had left behind. Some absences hold more presence than the thing itself did. Some empty seats are full of everything that mattered. The holidays had always been complicated for Renee in the way they are for anyone whose family is assembled from parts that don't perfectly fit. Her father had been gone since she was 9, and his absence had left a shape in every holiday table she had ever sat at. An empty chair that was not literally empty because someone else always sat there, but empty in the specific sense that the person who should have occupied it had made a different choice. She had not been angry about it for years. She had worked through the anger in her mid-20s the way you work through most accumulated griefs, slowly and without fanfare, and what she had come out with on the other side was not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of settled indifference, the way a healed bone is not the same as an unbroken bone, but is still a functioning bone. What she had kept from the anger was a finely calibrated sense of the difference between people who stayed and people who left, between people who showed up year after year and people who disappeared when the seasons changed. Walter had shown up for 11 years. He had not been her family. He had not been obligated to her in any formal sense. He had been a retired history teacher who liked turkey and black coffee and a paperback on Thanksgiving, who had loved a woman named Dorothy and missed her with a faithfulness that matched his living, who had watched a young woman working her way through something difficult and had thought, this person is worth watching. He had not told her she could do it, had not offered advice, had not inflated her with false assurances. He had simply watched and remembered and, at the end of his life, had put his watching into words and into an act of material care that met her at the exact place where her own effort had run low. That was the thing about Walter. He had understood that kindness is most useful when it is specific. Not generosity as a general posture, but attention as a practice, and then the specific intervention that the attention makes possible. He had been paying attention for 11 years. When the moment arrived, he knew exactly what was needed. $43,000 and a letter that named the thing she had been doing right. She had read that letter, or Lydia's reading of it, 4 more times across the years since. Not because she needed reminding, but because the language Walter had used was the kind of language she wanted to hold in her body. The kind that recalibrates something in you every time you return to it. The phrase about faithfulness. The sentence about patients who didn't yet know how lucky they were. She had never shown the letter to anyone. It was hers in the particular way that the most important things are always privately carried. She had never tried to describe it to Marcus or Dayon, or even to her mother. She had simply held it in the way you hold a stone that fits exactly right in the palm. Not for any practical purpose, but because the fit itself is a fact worth knowing. The second Thanksgiving she spent back in the booth, she was 33, and she had been at the hospital for a full year, and she was thinking about going back for her registered nursing degree. The math was different now. The student debt was gone, the car was paid, the savings account held more than it had ever held, and she had a year of steady income behind her. The registered nursing program at the university was 2 years full-time, or 3 years part-time. She sat in the booth and drank her coffee and looked at the numbers on her phone and thought about Walter doing the same arithmetic in the opposite direction, counting his years of service and adding 2 more for the road. She thought she knew now what the 2 extra years were. They were the years between the 11 Thanksgivings and his death, the years he had spent watching her go full-time and finish and start the job. The years he had calculated when he wrote the letter, knowing he would not see the end of the thing he had helped set in motion, but certain that it would end the right way. He had done the math from his side, and she was doing it from hers, and somewhere in the middle, the numbers came out even. She enrolled in January. She told Pete she was going down to one shift a week for as long as she was in the program, and Pete had looked at her with the expression of a man who had always believed she was going somewhere and was gratified to be proven right. She told her mother that evening, and Claudette had said good, and then asked what she wanted for dinner, which was right, which was the correct response to a thing that was simply the next step, and not an occasion for ceremony. The ceremony was private. It had happened in a parking lot in the November dark years ago. A woman sitting with a phone in her hand, and a number on her screen, and a letter in her memory, and a booth in a diner that was going to be empty from now on, that would always be in some essential way the most occupied seat she had ever known. She would finish the registered nursing program in 27 months. She would take the board exam in April and pass. She would go back to the same hospital floor, the same unit, the same colleagues who had told her she made the difficult days possible. She would, in the way of people who have been genuinely formed by their gratitude, carry Walter with her into every room where someone needed a person to stay. She would remember the weight of the word thank you, and she would say it herself to the people who brought the coffee and the clean linens and the tray of hospital food that nobody wanted, but everyone needed. She would remember that the work that holds the world together is almost never the work that receives the credit, and she would refuse to forget it, not as a discipline, but as a fact she had seen with her own eyes, proven in a corner booth over 11 years by a man in a wool coat who understood that the world keeps a longer ledger than most people ever bother to read. The photograph on the windowsill stayed. The apartment changed around it, better furniture, a rug she had been deliberate about, plants that had mostly survived. But the photograph stayed on the sill where the morning light hit it first. The corner booth, the salt shaker, the window with its winter angle. Some mornings she looked at it and thought of Dorothy, who had been happy there, and who had left happiness in the grain of the wood, the way a person's presence changes a place at a level too small to see. Some mornings she looked at it and thought of herself at 17 with the oversized apron and the unsteady handwriting, not knowing yet what the next 15 years would teach her, not knowing the shape of her own faithfulness, or how far it would carry her when the time came. She had not been prepared for any of it. She had simply stayed and shown up and done the next necessary thing year after year in the particular unspectacular way that most good lives are built. A man had watched her do it. He had found it worth his attention. That was the whole story, and it was more than enough.